$200 I've got. 200 quarter, 225 where? 225 going to one price. Less than final call at you. Tell you what about 225 a knife? Sold after the proxy bid at $200. Barry Weiss. Proxy bid, $200.
Storage Wars fans have been left stunned since the shocking truth behind Barry's so-called professional slacker persona was exposed. His carefree bids that once looked like harmless fun now play back like a trail of clues no one realized they were watching. How did this funny bidder hide a secret fortune? And why did one cast member remain eerily silent as if none of it surprised him? Join us as we peel back the layers of the double life that Barry Weiss desperately tried to keep hidden. The multi-million-dollar secret.
Can't wait to check out what my burritos bought me.
Where are we going to start fishing first in this ocean of stuff?
This is one of those where the arc jumps off.
When Barry Weiss first appeared on Storage Wars, he seemed to have wandered onto the set from some other dimension entirely. While Dave Hester stomped around barking "Yuppie" and Jared Schultz bickered with Brandy about money, Barry glided through storage units like a man who had just stumbled into a fascinating garage sale on his way to somewhere more interesting. He dressed like a rockabilly singer on his way to a costume party. Slicked back silver hair, vintage jackets, bow ties, sunglasses that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Fans fell in love with him immediately, and it was not just because he was funny. There was something that made him stand out from every other face on the screen. Barry never seemed worried. While other bidders did frantic mental math, calculating what they could flip a locker for before the auction ended, Barry bid on things because they caught his eye. One time, he bought a unit just because it contained an old circus poster that made him smile. Another time, Barry overpaid for a locker filled with vintage motorcycles, then spent the rest of the episode tinkering with them like a kid in a dream garage. He would lose money on a bid, shrug, and move on to the next locker with the same easy grin. It was certainly endearing, but it also planted a question in the back of every viewer's mind that never quite went away. How exactly does this man afford to live this way? After a few seasons, viewers stopped asking why Barry never seemed to have a job. It became easy to accept him as a type, maybe a trust fund kid who never grew up, or a lucky soul who won life's lottery and decided to spend his winnings on storage lockers and good times. Storage Wars existed on mystery, and so they never tried to discourage people's impression of Barry. But when the truth came out, it did not just surprise fans. It changed the way they looked at every bid he had ever made on the show. Who was Barry Weiss outside the show? The produce empire.
Wow. Look at all the briefcases. God knows what's in them.
Probably cash.
Okay, my proxy bid, I'm going to go 600 on this,
I'm
okay?
gonna go 600 on this unit.
600.
The produce business does not sound like a fun life, and really, it might not be for many. It's early mornings and cold warehouses, trucks backing into loading docks at hours when the rest of the world is still asleep. This is where Barry Weiss spent the bulk of his adult life, and this is where the foundation of everything viewers saw on television was actually laid. Barry and his brother owned Weiss Millman, a wholesale produce company based in Los Angeles that operated at a scale most people would never guess existed. This was not a corner grocery store or a small family stand at the farmer's market. It was a sprawling operation that supplied fruits and vegetables to restaurants, hotels, hospitals, schools, and institutions across Southern California. When a downtown LA hotel needed avocados for thousands of breakfast plates, Weiss Millman made it happen. But surprisingly, the world of wholesale produce is cutthroat. Competition is fierce, and relationships matter more than almost anything else. A handshake deal between a broker and a restaurant owner can determine who eats and who goes hungry, who profits and who loses. Barry spent decades navigating this world, learning to read people the way other people read books. These were not skills he developed for television. These were survival instincts honed in an industry where mistakes cost real money and reputations spread fast. The scale of the operation meant that Barry was not merely present in the business. He was expanding his reach year after year while the city of Los Angeles mushroomed around him. The post-war boom, the rise of restaurant culture, the explosion of tourism, and the institutionalization of everything from school lunch programs to hospital cafeterias all fed into the demand for reliable produce distribution. And Weiss Millman positioned itself to meet that demand. By the time Barry stepped away from the company, he had spent a lifetime building something that bore his family name and his personal stamp. He had earned the right to do absolutely nothing for the rest of his days. But the money, while substantial, was never really the point. The point was what the money made possible. And what it made possible was a return to something Barry had loved long before the first truckload of produce ever left a loading dock. As a younger man, before the business consumed his days and his attention, Barry had collected things, not as an investment, but because certain objects spoke to him in ways that made him want to own them. Vintage motorcycles with stories written into their rust, jukeboxes that still played scratchy old records, signs and statues and oddities that other people walked past without a second glance. The produce empire had pulled him away from that world, but it never made him forget it. Suddenly, the man who wandered through storage lockers for fun looked very different. The instincts that seemed playful now read like the residue of decades spent negotiating real money in real rooms with real consequences. And if the produce empire explained the wealth, it also raised another question about the one person who never seemed surprised by any of it. Why was Kenny the only one who behaved as though he had known the truth about Barry all along? The Kenny question.
What street were we on? Sutton?
Yes.
I know. Wait a minute, we might have gone by it. No, man, we went by it. Hang on.
Okay. Oh, Lord.
Hey, now.
I ain't never had one. But I would like to try out some little fortune cookie prizes.
The friendship between Barry and Kenny was one of those accidental television moments that producers dream about but can never quite manufacture. When Barry showed up on Storage Wars, he needed someone to share the experience with, someone who could ride along, offer a second opinion, and provide the kind of easy back and forth that makes reality television feel less like performance and more like life. Kenny Crossley fit that role perfectly. He was affable, slightly goofy.
Let me sit on the floor and see if I can push this.
What are you gonna limbo your way in?
Hell to the no.
Hell to the no.
And happy to let Barry take the lead while still contributing his own observations and reactions. The two of them bickered like an old married couple, finished each other's sentences, and seemed genuinely delighted to be in each other's company, even when the lockers they bought turned out to be filled with junk. It was the kind of chemistry that cannot be faked, and viewers responded to it immediately. What viewers did not know was that Kenny and Barry had a history that dated back decades before the first episode ever aired. Kenny was a real friend from the real world who had known Barry long before the fame. They had spent years together outside the spotlight, riding motorcycles and hunting for antiques. When Kenny showed up on screen, he was simply continuing a relationship that had already weathered countless adventures, and that authenticity bled through every scene they shared. But there was still more to this backstory. Kenny was the only person on the show who knew the full truth about Barry's life, who understood exactly where the money came from and why Barry approached the auctions with such casual indifference to profit. While other cast members speculated about Barry's background, Kenny simply existed alongside his friend the way he always had. Because for Kenny, it was normal. He had spent enough years in Barry's world to understand that his friend operated by a different set of rules. Rules that had nothing to do with the bottom line. Aside from the jokes and banter, there is an undeniable level of trust between the two friends. Kenny could have spilt the secrets in an interview, dropped hints on social media about the real Barry Weiss. Instead, he played it straight, stayed in his lane, and let the mystery unfold exactly as Barry wanted it to unfold. That kind of loyalty is way deeper than whatever relationship Barry had with the cast members who shared auction after auction with him without ever really knowing who they were standing next to. The other bidders saw what viewers saw: an eccentric older man with expensive tastes and a seemingly bottomless checking account. They competed against him, lost lockers to him, and watched him walk away with treasures they could have used to pay their bills. None of them understood that Barry was not playing for the same stakes. The bids, the losses, even the giveaways take on a completely different meaning, which leads to the most fascinating part of all. How many times did Barry deliberately lose money, not by accident, but by choice? Barry's intentional losses.
I'm really intrigued to find out what that face thing is inside that sofa unit.
First box of the day. Sandpaper. Hey now. Pretty far away from $1,500+, that's for sure.
The episode that best captures Barry's relationship with money aired sometime in the second season, though fans would not recognize its significance until years later. Barry won a locker for somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,500, which was more than most bidders were comfortable spending on a unit they had not yet opened. The other cast members watched him write the check with the usual mixture of confusion and amusement, the same expressions they always wore when Barry did something that defied typical auction knowledge. Inside the locker, after the cameras finished capturing the big reveal, Barry found a collection of fur coats. Not vintage furs with resale value, not rare pieces that collectors might fight over, just old coats that smelled faintly of mothballs and neglect. Any other bidder would have calculated the loss, factored it into the day's bottom line, and carried the disappointment home. Barry instead gathered the coats, walked over to Dave Hester, and gave them away. He did not want to sell them, he explained. He simply did not want them anymore. This moment should have raised more eyebrows than it did. Dave Hester spent his entire television persona built around profit, around winning, around squeezing every possible dollar out of every possible situation. Barry handed him a stack of coats worth exactly nothing and walked away smiling. Viewers accepted it as part of Barry's charm. He was the guy who played by different rules, who valued the hunt more than the kill, who collected experiences rather than cash. What no one considered was that Barry was not simply playing by different rules. He was playing an entirely different game, one where the scores did not matter because he had already won decades earlier. There were other moments scattered through the seasons, small signals that only cohere into meaning when viewed with full knowledge of his background. The time he bought a locker for several $1,000s based solely on a vintage sign he spotted through a crack in the door. The time he spent an entire episode restoring a motorcycle he found, only to give it to a friend rather than sell it. The time he bid against Dave Hester on a unit, drove the price up past any reasonable valuation, won the locker, and then seemed genuinely puzzled when Dave stormed off angry. These were not the actions of a man trying to make a living. They were the actions of a man treating the auction circuit like a country club, like a hobby, like an expensive amusement park, where the price of admission barely registered against the balance of his accounts. Seen in that light, the auctions stop looking like a workplace and start looking like a playground for a man who had already won the only game that mattered years earlier. And when he finally stepped away from the format that framed him as just another bidder, the illusion disappeared completely. Because what happened when Barry was given his own show revealed more about his real life than Storage Wars ever could. So, what did the world see when the cameras followed him without the rules of the auction holding him in place? The spin-off that proved the truth.
Half of it or all of it. You can.
I didn't get a locker today, so I thought I'd help Barry with his.
Well, we're about to give you your fix, son. Where is it? Where was it?
What did I get myself into?
There's a white door.
They're all white doors.
When the call came about a spin-off, Barry could have said no. He had already built a fan base that would remember him regardless of what came next. The smart move would have been to let Storage Wars continue without him while he returned to the life that had always been waiting. But Barry had never been particularly interested in smart moves, and the proposal that landed on his table offered something far more appealing than a quiet life. Buried Treasure premiered in 2014 with a simple concept that anyone who knew Barry could have predicted. He would travel across America in search of rare antiques and collectibles, accompanied by Kenny and a small crew, wandering through barns and garages and estate sales and anywhere else interesting objects might hide. The show did not pretend he was buying to resell. It simply followed Barry as he did exactly what he had always done, what he had done for decades before the cameras ever appeared, what he would continue doing long after they left. He bought things because they fascinated him. If they happened to be valuable, that was incidental. The difference between the two shows was huge. On Storage Wars, Barry existed within a structure designed around conflict and competition. On his own show, he became something else entirely. He became the subject rather than the interruption. Viewers who tuned in expecting more of the same auction antics found themselves watching something closer to a travelogue of a man who had figured out exactly how he wanted to spend his time and had somehow convinced a network to pay for it. The auctions happened occasionally, but they were just stops along the journey. There were moments on Buried Treasure that would never have made sense on the original show. Whole episodes dedicated to a single object that caught Barry's eye. Hours of screen time spent negotiating with sellers who had no idea they were talking to a television personality. Long stretches where the cameras simply watched Barry think about whether something was worth owning. Barry would walk through someone's barn, pick up a rusted sign, turn it over in his hands, and the audience would wait to see whether this particular piece of junk would join his collection or remain in the dust. It was strangely compelling precisely because it was so authentic, so clearly aligned with the actual rhythms of Barry's life, rather than the manufactured beats of reality television. With the competition stripped away, there was nothing left to hide behind, only the pure expression of how Barry actually chose to live. And that made one final mystery impossible to ignore. If the auctions were just a hobby and television was just a detour, then what does a man with that level of freedom do when the cameras are gone and the schedule is entirely his own? How Barry spends his real fortune.
At present, I've got about 10 motorcycles. Am I late? And cars, I guess I'm up to about 10 cars now. I brought my cowboy Cadillac.
Boy, that thing is something, I'm telling you. That's gorgeous.
Put the horns on just for you.
The warehouses in Hollywood where Barry stores his collection are not open to the public, but those who have stepped inside describe something close to a fever dream. One visitor who came for the travel trailers stayed for the stories, walking past gleaming silver streaks and Spartans from the 1920s and 1930s, all parked in formation like a caravan frozen in time. Barry knew each one in salesman-like detail, could recite where he found them and what it took to bring them home. The trailers were just one room in a museum that sprawls across multiple buildings, a collection that started decades before the cameras arrived and will continue growing long after they leave. The cars alone could fill several lifetimes of obsession. There is the 1939 Zephyr known as Scrape, a heavily modified coupe that spent years in the Peterson Museum before Barry brought it home. There is the King of Mercs, a 1951 Mercury that survived a disagreement with a semi-truck and emerged reborn in satin black. And then there is the Cowboy Cadillac, the 1947 fastback that Frank DeRosa built and that Barry insists will never be for sale. A car so distinctive that it earned the title the most famous car in Los Angeles. He pulls up to events in different vehicles each time, not because he is showing off, but because choosing which treasure to drive is its own kind of pleasure. The motorcycle collection rivals the cars, though it came with a price that nearly cost him everything. In April 2019, Barry was riding with a friend when a car pulled out of a parking space and changed everything. He spent 2 months in intensive care, underwent multiple surgeries, and recovered from chest and leg trauma that left him hospitalized while fans prayed and waited. The accident could have ended his collecting days. Instead, once he healed, He kept riding and being exactly who he had always been. The warehouses are still filled with new treasures because stopping was never really an option. The difference now is that the cameras only appear when he wants them. He returned to Storage Wars briefly in 2021 and again in 2023, popping up to remind audiences why they fell in love with him in the first place, then disappearing back into his world when the filming ended. No contracts are forcing him to show up. No producers calling in favors. No obligations beyond the ones he chooses. He has reached the stage of life where fame is an amusement rather than a goal, where television appearances are detours rather than destinations. The professional slacker title he once joked about has become something closer to the literal truth. He still travels and still finds objects that make him stop and smile. The difference between now and his buried treasure days is that the discoveries are his alone unless he decides to share them. He has earned the right to keep some things to himself, and he exercises that right without apology. Barry Weiss spent years on television living what looked like a double life, and fans speculated where the money came from and whether the persona was authentic. And now, long after the speculation has died down and the revelations have settled into public knowledge, he lives completely in the open, simply being himself while the world watches and finally understands that they were never really fooled at all. Now that the mystery is gone and the fortune is no longer a secret, was Barry ever the eccentric outsider the show made him seem? And if Barry's double life stayed hidden for so long, how many more secrets from Storage Wars are still waiting to be exposed? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.